every escape route! Tanko! Zainab! Stop right there!
No! Zainab!
This is the story of Tanko, a teacher of children. This is the story of Zainab, a woman who did not choose the life that was forced onto her back like a heavy basket of firewood. This is the story of a bandit who called himself King of the Bush. This is the story of a jealous man's eyes, an old woman's secret, and a river that took a memory and gave back a second chance at love. In the quiet farming town of Bagega, a town so small that everyone knew whose goat had wandered into whose cassava farm, there lived a young school teacher named Tanko Adamu. Now, you must understand something about small towns like Bagega. In such a place, a man's reputation is built one small kindness at a time, like a wall built brick upon brick, until one day the whole town looks at that wall and says, "Ah, this one is a good man." That is what had happened to Tanko. Brick by brick, kindness by kindness, over many years. He was the kind of man mothers pointed to when scolding their sons in the market square. "Why can't you be like Tanko?" they would say, wagging a finger, while the sons rolled their eyes the way sons everywhere have always rolled their eyes at their mothers. Tanko was not a rich man. A teacher's salary in a town like Bagega barely stretched to cover rent, rice, and the occasional new wrapper for special occasions. But he was rich in the ways the elders always insisted mattered more: patience, generosity, and the discipline to keep his word. He taught mathematics and English at the community secondary school, standing each morning in a small classroom with a chalkboard so worn that his handwriting sometimes disappeared into its scratches. But every single evening after class, and listen carefully because this detail matters, he sat under a great mango tree behind his rented compound and tutored the poorer children of the town for free, using nothing but sticks in the dirt to teach fractions, using stones to teach addition, using his own quiet patience to teach children that their poverty was not the same thing as their potential. His compound itself was small, 2 rooms only, with a tin roof that sang loudly, almost musically whenever the rains came, and a narrow veranda where he kept a single wooden bench for evening visitors. His neighbor, an elderly widow, the town called Hajia Amina, and do not confuse her, my people, for there are 2 important old women in this tale, and both matter, often sent her grandson over with plates of tuwo and miarkuka, refusing any payment, insisting always that a man who teaches other people's children for free deserves at the very least to be fed for free. Tanko was engaged to be married. Her name was Ladi, the daughter of the local grain merchant, a woman with a laugh so quick and so bright that market women said you could hear her joy 3 stalls away before you ever saw her face. Their wedding had been set for the dry season, only 4 months away at the time this story begins. Ladi would tease him constantly. "Tanko, you spend more time correcting your students' homework than paying attention to me." And Tanko, ever patient, ever gentle, would only smile that smile of his and answer, "A mind not fed, my dear Ladi, is worse off than a stomach not fed." Ladi would roll her eyes exactly the way his students did, but she loved him for it all the same. Now, my people, no man is without his sorrows, and Tanko carried one quietly, like a stone in his pocket, that he touched only when alone. Years before, his younger brother had died in a road accident, on a journey that Tanko himself was originally meant to take, before he switched seats with his brother at the very last moment, for reasons so small and forgotten now that they barely mattered anymore. He never fully forgave himself for that switch. That quiet, private guilt is what made him so gentle with everyone else in his life, as though kindness poured out to the whole world could somehow repay a debt that only he believed he still owed. On the afternoon before everything changed, and mark this well, because the ordinary comes right before the terrible, Tanko had gone to Ladi's family compound to propose a small change to their wedding plans. He wanted to move the date 2 weeks earlier so that his ailing uncle from Kaduna could still make the journey while his health allowed it. Ladi had laughed at him, teasing, "You are more organized about our wedding than you are about your own examination schedule, Tanko." And he had laughed with her, promising to fix both matters before the season ended. That evening, the last ordinary evening of his old life, though he did not know it, Tanko stayed late at the school, grading examination papers by the flickering light of a lantern, because the headmaster, locking the gate behind him as he left, warned Tanko not to walk the bush path after dark. There had been, he said, strange movements reported near the forest edge in recent weeks, motorcycles at odd hours, footprints where there should be none. Tanko, tired and eager only to see Ladi before she slept, waved off the warning the way tired men so often wave off warnings that later prove, in hindsight, to have been the loudest kind of mercy. He was walking home along the bush path, a shortcut through the forest edge that he had walked 1,000 times without so much as a scratch, when he heard motorcycles. Many of them moving fast, engines cutting through the still night air in a way that made even the crickets suddenly, unnervingly go silent. He barely had time to step off the path before torchlight swept across his face. By the time his mind caught up to what was happening, rough hands already had him by the collar, dragging him toward the waiting bikes. He fought, briefly, uselessly, the way any man would, until the flat of a rifle butt caught him hard across the temple. Through the ringing in his ears, through the spinning dark closing in around his vision, he heard a voice say, flatly, without malice, without hesitation, the way a butcher speaks of meat, "This one, don't kill. Teachers bring good ransom." And Tanko's world went black. He would say much later that the last clear thought he carried into that darkness was not of Ladi, not even of his own fear, but of the ungraded examination papers still sitting in his bag. A strange small worry to carry into captivity, but perhaps, my people, it was easier to hold on to arithmetic than to hold on to the thought of Ladi lying awake, alone, waiting for a man who would not come home that night or for many nights after. Tanko woke to a world he did not recognize. His wrists were bound with rope so tight it had already begun to swell his fingers into fat, useless things. The air smelled of wood smoke and unwashed bodies, and something else beneath it. Fear, perhaps, which has its own smell if you have ever truly been afraid. Around him sat other captives, a retired civil servant with trembling hands, 2 teenage boys taken together from a neighboring village who clung to each other like brothers, even though they were not, and an old woman named Hajia Rakia. This is the second Hajia. Remember her name well, for she carries one of the heaviest secrets in this entire story, whose frail body belied a pair of eyes that missed absolutely nothing that passed before them. This camp belonged to a man known across 3 local government areas simply as Kabir Dogo Sarki. Dogo meaning the tall one, though by the time our story takes place, fear itself had made him taller in people's minds than he had ever truly been in body. Dogo ran his forest kingdom the way a small king rules a small, cruel country. Ransom negotiations conducted over crackling phone lines, cattle raids planned like military campaigns, and a rotating cast of foot soldiers whose loyalty lasted exactly as long as the money kept flowing and not 1 day longer. Each evening, he held a kind of court beneath a great neem tree at the camp center, settling disputes among his men with the casual, terrible authority of a man who had never once in his adult life been told the word no. The camp itself was a scattering of tents and mud brick shelters hidden so deep in forest terrain that even the most experienced local hunters avoided the area, whispering of it the way children whisper of haunted places. Smoke from cooking fires was carefully managed, thinned and scattered to avoid drawing the attention of aircraft that occasionally passed overhead. Captives were kept in a fenced enclosure near the eastern edge of the camp, close enough that they could hear the river at night, its constant rushing whisper a cruel kind of company, close enough to torment, too far to offer any real hope of reaching it. Dogo's most trusted lieutenant was a wiry, quiet man named Danjuma. Danjuma had been with Dogo from the very beginning, from before the camp had a name, from before Dogo had ever taken a wife. Danjuma spoke rarely, but he noticed everything. Which guard dozed during the third watch, which captive whispered too long in the dark, which supply crate arrived a few tins lighter than it should have. Dogo trusted Danjuma's eyes more than he trusted his own, and it was precisely this trust that would matter so much later when Danjuma's growing suspicion fixed itself onto one particular person in the camp, a person none of the new captives, including Tanko, yet understood the importance of: Dogo's wife, Zainab. And here, my people, is where our story must slow down completely, because you cannot understand anything that follows without understanding Zainab from the very root of her sorrow. Zainab was not always the bandit's wife. Before that name was forced onto her like a garment she never asked to wear, she was simply Zainab Lawal, a bright young woman from a village called Rimi, 3 full years before Tanko was ever taken from that bush path. Her father, Alhaji Lawal, was a proud man, a farmer who had once been comfortable, who had borrowed money from a local trader to survive 2 consecutive failed harvests, 2 seasons where the rain refused to fall when it was needed and fell too hard when it was not. When Dogo's men, then a smaller, rougher outfit, not yet the feared kingdom it would become, raided the area demanding what they called protection tax, Alhaji Lawal simply did not have the money to pay. And Dogo, young and ambitious in his cruelty even then, made an offer that was less a proposal and more a threat, dressed in the clothes of a proposal. His daughter, in exchange for the dead disappearing and the family being left alone forever. Zainab remembered that night with a clarity that never fully faded, even years later, even after so many other memories of her old life had softened at the edges the way old photographs soften in the sun. She remembered her mother's hands shaking as she packed a small bag of Zainab's belongings, as though packing gently could somehow soften what was actually happening. She remembered her younger sisters crying without fully understanding why, only sensing that something terrible was taking their eldest sister away from them forever. And she remembered, this above everything else, her father unable to look at her at all, his eyes fixed stubbornly on the bare earth, his voice barely a whisper as he said, "Forgive me, Zainab, I have failed you as a father." Her father wept the night he agreed to this bargain. Zainab herself was never once asked. She was taken that very night, riding on the back of a motorcycle into the darkness that swallowed everything she had ever known, clutching a small bag of clothes and a single photograph of her family, a photograph she would guard fiercely years afterward, hidden inside the folds of her wrapper, as though it were the last remaining proof that her old life had ever existed at all. And there was one more thing Zainab carried into that darkness, my people. One thing even heavier than the photograph. A young man from her village named Sadiq, whom she had quietly, privately loved, who had gone north seeking work only weeks before her abduction, promising to return for her once he had saved enough. She never had the chance to tell him what happened to her. To Sadiq, she simply vanished from the earth like smoke swallowed by wind. 3 long years passed inside that camp. Zainab learned, the way every captive eventually learns, that survival is its own quiet, exhausting discipline. She made herself useful, she made herself quiet, and slowly, without ever once choosing it, she became someone the entire camp orbited around, the way smaller stars orbit a larger one whether they wish to or not. Even Dogo, brutal as he was in every other corner of his life, grew strangely, helplessly dependent on her calm presence, on the steadiness she brought to a place built entirely on chaos and fear. She was, in her own bitter and private words to herself on the loneliest nights, a wife in name only, and a prisoner in every truth that mattered. But there was one thing about Zainab that even 3 long years of captivity had failed to erase completely. She still carried a conscience inside her, stubborn as a root that refuses to die even when the tree above it has long since been cut down. It was that conscience that began sneaking extra food to the captives when the guards were not watching closely. It was that same conscience that made her linger a little too long near Tanko's corner of the enclosure, listening quietly to him teach the 2 teenage captive boys their multiplication tables by moonlight, as though he were refusing, simply through the stubborn act of teaching, to let captivity steal their futures the way it had already stolen so much else. Danjuma noticed this lingering. Danjuma, as we have already said, always noticed everything. "She spends too much time near the school teacher," Danjuma said one evening to Dogo, as the 2 men sat cleaning their rifles beside the fire, the metal clicking softly in the dark. Dogo laughed the comment off easily. "She spends time near everyone, Danjuma. That is simply her nature. She has always been this way." But Danjuma's suspicion, my people, did not grow from loyalty alone. There was a second, darker root buried beneath it, one this story will not fully expose until later, so hold this thread gently in your mind for now and do not let it go. For the moment, know only this: Danjuma watched Zainab the way a hungry man watches food that belongs, unfairly he believes, to someone else's table. Meanwhile, in the quiet hours between guard rotations, Zainab and Tanko began slowly and carefully to speak to one another. At first, it was purely practical. She brought him extra water when the guards were distracted, warned him which particular guard grew harsher and crueler after dark, told him quietly when a ransom call might buy the captives a slightly easier week ahead. But practical conversations, as our elders have always warned, have a dangerous way of becoming personal conversations if given enough patient time. Tanko learned piece by careful piece about Rimi, about her father's shame, about Sadiq, the boy she had loved and lost not to death but to cruel circumstance. Zainab in turn learned about Ladi, about the wedding that was meant to happen in the dry season, about the younger brother Tanko still quietly grieved every single day of his life. Neither of them gave a name to what was growing quietly between them. Both of them, if we are honest, felt something neither one dared to name aloud. 3 months into his captivity, Tanko decided he could wait no longer for rescue to arrive on its own. Ladi's family had received a ransom demand they simply could not afford to pay. Word moved quietly through the camp, the way bad news always finds its way through even the most guarded walls, that if payment did not arrive soon, Dogo intended to make an example of someone. A phrase every single captive understood instantly and feared completely. Tanko began planning quietly with the retired civil servant and the 2 teenage boys. It was Hajia Rakia, the old woman with the watchful eyes, who gave them the one piece of intelligence that would matter most. The guard rotation carried a 15-minute gap every single night, right after the second watch changed, when the eastern fence closest to the river sat briefly, dangerously unmanned. On the chosen night, thick clouds rolled in low overhead, swallowing even the thin sliver of moon that usually lit the camp's edges. For the first 10 minutes, it seemed almost as though fortune itself had chosen to cooperate with them. The four of them moved low and slow through the darkness, Tanko leading, with the civil servant close behind, the two teenage boys trailing at the rear, their hearts hammering so loudly in their own ears that each of them was certain the whole sleeping camp must surely hear it too. But escape plans, my people, rarely move in real life as they move inside a frightened man's mind. One of the teenage boys, gripped by a fear he could not fully control, brushed against a stack of cooking pots, balanced precariously against a support post near the kitchen area. The top pot tipped, then the next after that, a slow, agonizing cascade of clattering metal that felt to Tanko like it lasted an entire lifetime, though in truth, it was over within mere seconds. The clang rang out across the sleeping camp like a gunshot fired directly into the night. Dogs began barking immediately, straining hard against their tethers. A guard, jolted violently from half-sleep, shouted a single sharp word into the darkness. Within seconds, the entire camp erupted into pure chaotic motion. Torches flared to life one after another. Men stumbled from their tents half-dressed, rifles gripped in unsteady hands, shouting conflicting orders over one another. Somewhere near the center of the camp, a generator sputtered violently to life, flooding part of the enclosure with harsh white light. Dogo himself burst from his tent bare-chested, roaring furiously for his men to seal the perimeter completely. His voice cut above the general panic like a blade through cloth. Tanko and the civil servant, running now in full and total desperation, made it almost to the tree line before two guards tackled them hard from the side, driving them into the dirt with bruising force. The two boys, slower and smaller, were caught even sooner. One of them dragged roughly back by the collar of his shirt, screaming his own brother's name uselessly into the chaos, though no brother stood anywhere nearby to hear him. Danjuma personally led the recapture effort, moving through the pandemonium with a calm that stood out starkly, almost eerily against the panic surrounding him. His rifle never once wavered from wherever he chose to point it. His eyes scanned the chaos methodically, cataloging every face, every position, every distance with cold precision. And it was in that careful scanning that he saw something which would fuel his suspicion for many weeks to come. Zainab, standing near the eastern fence, far from her sleeping quarters, at precisely the moment the escape attempt had unfolded, her expression unreadable in the flickering torchlight. She would later claim, quietly and carefully, that she had simply gone to fetch water. No one, and especially not Danjuma, fully believed her. The punishment for that failed escape was swift and brutal, the way punishment in such places always is. Tanko was beaten severely and left tied to a post for 2 full days without shade, the sun burning down on him mercilessly. The civil servant, older and physically weaker than the others, did not survive the injuries sustained that night, a loss that shook the entire camp into a heavy, uneasy silence for many days afterward. The two boys were separated and moved to an entirely different camp, and Tanko never once learned what ultimately became of them, a small mystery that haunted him long after. It was Zainab,
under the cover of darkness and at enormous personal risk to herself, who came quietly to Tanko's post carrying water and crushed herbs for his wounds. He asked, "Why?" Her voice raw and cracked from thirst and pain. She only replied softly, "Because someone did this same kindness for me once, long ago, and it kept me human when everything around me was working hard to make me forget how." She never told him on that night or any other exactly who that person had been. If you're enjoying this story so far, take 1 second to leave a like. It really helps this channel grow. Now let's get back to our story.
Now, my people, here comes the first true twist of this story, so lean in closer. Danjuma's obsession with Zainab was never purely about loyalty to his boss, though he told himself this lie so many times over the years that he had almost begun to believe it himself. Years before Zainab ever arrived at that camp, Danjuma had asked Dogo for permission to take a wife of his own from a nearby village. Dogo had refused him flatly, insisting that a lieutenant needed to remain unattached and dangerous, not softened by the burdens of family life. Danjuma, ever obedient, had accepted this refusal outwardly, but the resentment calcified quietly inside him, year after silent year, like sediment slowly hardening into stone at the bottom of a still river. When Zainab arrived and Dogo effectively claimed her for his own, something twisted further and deeper inside Danjuma. He told himself over and over that his suspicion of her was purely about camp security, about protecting his boss's interests. In truth, it was jealousy, wearing the convenient mask of vigilance. He watched her not only to protect Dogo, but because some dark, unspoken part of him wanted desperately to find a reason to see her fall. And perhaps, buried in the chaos of her falling, a reason to finally claim for himself what he had long felt unjustly denied. This is precisely why Danjuma pushed Dogo so relentlessly in the weeks following the failed escape. "Question her properly," he insisted. "She was standing at that fence for a reason, and you know it as well as I do." Dogo, for the very first time in their marriage, began to look at his wife with something other than simple possessive comfort. He began, slowly, to look at her instead with doubt. And doubt, my people, in a camp built entirely upon violence and fragile loyalty, is a dangerous seed to plant. It grows roots faster than anyone expects. By now, 4 full months had passed since Tanko's abduction from that quiet bush path. Ladi's family, through the determined intervention of local vigilantes and a sympathetic contact within the police, had finally scraped together the original ransom amount. But Dogo, emboldened and made reckless by Danjuma's growing paranoia about a possible traitor within his own camp, suddenly doubled his demand without warning, sensing an opportunity to squeeze even more from a desperate family. Zainab overheard this decision. She understood with a clarity that frightened her deeply that Tanko might now never be released at all. That Dogo, increasingly suspicious of everyone around him, including his own wife, might simply choose to make Tanko disappear entirely rather than risk yet another escape attempt, exposing further cracks in his authority. That night, lying awake long after the camp had fallen quiet, Zainab made her decision. She would not merely help Tanko escape this time, she would live with him, whatever the cost. Using the careful knowledge Hajia had gathered of a second, far less guarded escape route along a rocky ridge above the river, a path used only by the camp's water carriers during the driest months of the year, Zainab guided Tanko out beneath a moonless sky. Hajia herself, too old and too physically frail to survive the demands of the escape, chose deliberately to remain behind, but not before creating one final distraction, a small, carefully contained fire
near the food stores that drew several guards away from the ridge at exactly the critical moment they were needed elsewhere. For nearly 20 minutes, it seemed as though they might truly make it clean. They moved quickly along the narrow ridge path, Zainab whispering the directions Hajia had drilled carefully into her memory that very afternoon. Left at the fallen baobab, then straight until the path splits. Always take the lower fork, never the upper. Each whispered instruction was a small, fragile act of faith between two people who only months earlier had been nothing more to one another than a captor's wife and a frightened captive. Then, Danjuma, who had been watching Zainab's movement obsessively for many weeks by now, made his nightly round past her tent purely out of habit and found it standing empty. He stood there for a long, silent moment, staring at the untouched sleeping mat, and something inside him, jealousy, wounded vigilance, damaged pride, perhaps all three tangled hopelessly together, told him with absolute certainty exactly where she had gone and exactly why. He did not bother waking Dogo first. He gathered 4 armed men himself, moving with the quiet, urgent hunger of a man who wanted, more than anything else in that moment, to be the one who found her first. They reached the ridge just as Tanko and Zainab arrived at its narrowest point, where the rocky path pinched between a sheer, terrible drop on one side and a solid wall of stone on the other, barely wide enough for a single person to pass at a time. A shout rang out behind them in the darkness.
Tanko!
Then another.
Zainab!
Then the sharp,
Stop right there!
unmistakable crack of a rifle, the sound bouncing violently off the ridge walls until it seemed to come from every direction at once, surrounding them entirely. It was in that final, desperate stretch of narrow path that a bullet meant for Tanko struck Zainab instead. She had pushed him aside a mere half-second before the shot rang out, taking the wound meant for him high on her own shoulder. The impact sent her stumbling violently off the narrow ridge path, and she fell, down the rocky slope, into the roaring, rushing river below, swallowed almost instantly by darkness and white water. Tanko did not hesitate, not even for a single heartbeat. Under continuing gunfire, in near total darkness, he went down into that river after her. The river carried them nearly 2 kilometers downstream before Tanko finally managed to drag Zainab's unconscious body onto the muddy bank, both of them battered, bleeding and half-drowned from the violent journey. Behind them, far in the distance now, the gunfire and shouting slowly faded into nothing more than an uneasy silence. Whether because the bandits had simply lost their trail in the darkness, or because Dogo himself, in some private reckoning known only to him, chose not to press the search past the river's edge, no one would ever know for certain. Tanko carried her for the remainder of that long night, moving steadily away from the water, deeper toward the road that eventually led to a small trading settlement 2 hours from Bagega. By the time villagers finally found them near dawn, Tanko collapsed from sheer exhaustion, still holding tightly onto Zainab, as though letting go might mean losing her forever to the darkness. Zainab was alive, but she was no longer entirely herself. The gunshot wound, the significant blood loss, and the sheer trauma of the fall had taken something precious from her that no herb, no hospital bed could immediately return: her memory. She woke 3 full days later in a small clinic bed in Bagega, staring at Tanko with the confused, searching eyes of a woman meeting a complete stranger for the very first time. "Who are you?" she asked him softly. "And who, may I ask, am I?" Tanko made a choice in that fragile moment that would define the entire remainder of this story. He did not tell her everything, not at first, not all at once. He simply said gently, "You are safe now.
My name is Tanko. I will help you remember, one small day at a time." He could have told her right then about Dogo, about the camp, about Danjuma's jealous watching eyes and the many years she had survived as a captive wife. Instead, he chose to give her time and to give himself time to quietly consider what telling her the full truth might eventually cost them both. Ladi, upon learning everything that had happened to Tanko during his long captivity, made her own difficult and quietly courageous decision. She released Tanko gently from their engagement, not out of bitterness or anger, but because she recognized clearly something in the way Tanko now looked at this wounded, memoryless woman he had nearly died to save, a devotion that had quietly grown larger, without his even realizing it, than the wedding they had once so carefully planned together. "I loved the man who came home to me," Ladi told him with a sad but genuine gentleness. "But that man is looking at someone else entirely now, Tanko, even if he has not yet admitted this truth fully to himself." Over the many months that followed, as Zainab's body slowly healed and her memory remained frustratingly, stubbornly absent, something entirely new began to grow quietly between her and Tanko. Not simply a continuation of whatever complicated bond had existed inside the camp's fences long ago, but something built completely fresh, upon honesty, upon patience, upon the strange and unexpected gift of a genuine second beginning. Tanko taught her, the same patient way he had always taught his students under that mango tree, small pieces of a past she could not personally access, letting her decide entirely for herself, again and again, whether she wished to stay beside him. In time, they began, quietly and carefully, to speak of marriage. But folklore, my people, real or told beside a fire, rarely releases its grip so easily. Many months later, a man arrived quietly in Bagega, asking careful questions about a woman named Zainab Lawal, originally from the distant village of Rimi. His name, as you have perhaps already guessed, was Sadiq, the very same young man Zainab had once quietly loved before her abduction, who had spent 3 long years chasing every camp rumor and market whisper, desperately trying to find the woman who had vanished so completely from his life without a single word of explanation. When Sadiq finally stood before her once more, something flickered briefly behind Zainab's eyes. Not full memory exactly, but a fragment, a feeling, a strange and unexplainable familiarity that she could not put into proper words. For a long, suspended moment, standing between 2 men who both loved her in entirely different ways, Zainab said absolutely nothing at all. And then, finally, she spoke the words that would decide everything that came after. "I do not remember loving you, Sadiq, but I remember choosing every single day since I first woke beside that river to love the man who never once let go of me. I believe in the end that this choosing must count for something too." Sadiq, heartbroken but not cruel in his heartbreak, understood her completely. He left Bagega carrying the quiet peace of finally knowing she was alive and safe, even though she was no longer his to hold. Love built instead up. Tanko and Zainab were married the following dry season in a small and simple ceremony held beneath that very same mango tree where Tanko had once tutored the poorer children of Bagega for free. Danjuma was eventually arrested during a joint military operation against Dogo's camp nearly 2 years later. Dogo himself was never captured. Some say, even now, that he still moves quietly through the northern forests, a ghost haunting a kingdom of his own cruel making. Hajia Rakia, freed during that very same operation, spent her remaining years peacefully in Bagega, welcomed warmly by Tanko and Zainab as family, finally at peace with the redemption she had earned through her one final dangerous act of courage. So then, my people, what does this long story truly teach us? It teaches us that people are not always who circumstance cruelly forces them to become. Zainab was never a bandit wife by choice. She was a stolen daughter, a grieving lover, a quiet conscience simply surviving inside captivity, patiently waiting for her chance to be fully herself again. How often in our own lives do we judge others harshly for roles that circumstance alone has forced onto them, without ever once asking what they were before or what they are still quietly fighting every single day to become again? It teaches us that love built purely on convenience or fear rarely survives the years, but love built instead upon someone choosing you again and again, even without full memory, even without any real obligation to do so, that kind of love carries roots deep enough to survive even a raging river. Zainab did not need her memory of Sadiq to know clearly what her own heart had already decided in the present moment. Sometimes, my people, the truest love is not the love we remember most clearly, but the love we simply keep choosing quietly, day after ordinary day. And it teaches us, perhaps most importantly of all, that suspicion and jealousy, exactly like Danjuma's, will always find something to feed upon if left to grow unchecked in silence, poisoning the very person who carries it long before it ever truly touches the one it was originally aimed at. But redemption, exactly like Hajia's, remains always possible, no matter how late in life it finally arrives. She spent many years surviving through small betrayals of others, and she spent her final, bravest act on doing every single one of them with one dangerous choice to help two strangers find their freedom. Even Dogo, the man responsible for so much of this suffering, could not fully escape what he himself had built. A kingdom constructed entirely from stolen people, my people, is always, eventually, a kingdom that finds a way to steal itself apart from the inside. If this story has moved something quietly inside you tonight, if it has taught you something true about resilience, about forgiveness, or about the strange and unpredictable shape that real love can take, leave your thoughts for us below and tell us which person in this story touched your heart the most. And remember always, as our elders have told us since long before any of us were born, the river does not forget the stone that once blocked it. It only learns patiently to flow around it, and in the flowing, it becomes stronger for having known that stone at all. Thank you so much for staying with us till the end. Kindly like this video if you've enjoyed our story. Subscribe if you love stories like this with lessons to learn from. See you next time.